Yeah, they're a little bit. Well, not really connected, but what brought me to Cambodia were refugee issues. So I was a lawyer in Australia. I was a lawyer in a commercial law firm, actually working for insurance companies on public liability issues in Sydney. But I worked full time while I went through law school in a law firm, and the person I worked with, um, a person I flatted with, is also going through law school, working full time. He worked for a community legal centre that did refugee advocacy work. And just as we got admitted, there was a project where they needed 4 or 5 lawyers to go to a refugee detention centre in far northwest Australia back in 1992 to assist asylum seekers who were applying for refugee status in Australia. They can come by boat. And
Mm.
because they'd put them in detention, they were entitled to legal assistance under the convention. So because the government wouldn't let them out, to get legal assistance by law, they had to bring lawyers to them, so to speak. So my friend's organisation, the Refugee Council, was approached to provide 4 or 5 lawyers. So I was actually on my way to the UK. I'd finished working and I was on my way. I'm British originally. I was on my way back to the UK to work there, and Seth, the friend, said, "Look, can you come up? It's only a 3 month thing. We just have to go up and help asylum seekers with their applications for refugee status, and it'll take 3 months, and then go to England after that." So it was sort of helping a friend out. So we went up. This was December 1991 or January 1992 kind of thing. So we went up for all of us. We actually all met at law school actually, and to assist these, and they were from Cambodia this back then. So this is when boats had fled from Sihanoukville after the Vietnamese had pulled out back in '89, and when the war with China happened, and so the Vietnamese pulled out. They were governing Cambodia, and so '89 they pulled out, and it left the Gulf. The Khmer Rouge moved back in, so some of their old strongholds, Phnom Vora, these places, Palin, they always were, Phnom Vora, Sihanoukville. And so a number of boats fled to try to get to the Indonesian refugee camps. So this was '89, early '90. This happened about an exodus, and what happened was the Indonesian camps no longer decided they would no longer. They decided they were full, so to speak, and they wouldn't allow any more in. So they kind of pushed the last remaining boats back out and said, "Look, here's some water and here's a map, and Australia's down there. Good luck." And so about 4 or 5 boats turned up in Australia, and so the Australian government sort of panicked and made a mandatory detention regime. So our job was they'd all applied for asylum, of course, and they were about to get the decision. So our job was to assist anybody that was rejected if they wanted to appeal, help them with their appeals. So we were representing the asylum seekers. We responded to government. When you work with government, so it ordinarily takes a lot longer. So 3 months became 2 years. Got a story short on that one. So I was up there for 2 years. At the end of it was the resolution. There were also Vietnamese and Chinese in amongst the group. There was only about 150 asylum seekers, maybe 300 people up. But for the Vietnamese and Chinese, they actually granted them refugee status in Australia. But for the Cambodians, they wouldn't do it for political reasons because of the Thai refugee camp issue and the peace process. The idea was to empty those camps, bring them back to Cambodia for the election, which is probably '93. So if they called this particular group in Cambodia refugees, there's a political statement saying it's unsafe to return to Cambodia. That would have put a spanner in the works of the resolution that was going on to empty the Thai camps of about 300,000 people. And our foreign minister at the time, Gareth Evans, was a chief architect of that. So no matter how much we argued they were genuine refugees under the convention definition, the government said, "Look, we're not going to grant them refugee status." So we took them all to court. We won in court, and the court recognised they're refugees, but the court doesn't have the power to grant refugee status. Only the government does. The government
The
said,
Australian court.
"Yeah," and the government said, "Look, we're just not going to accept them. We don't care." So they come up with a resolution, and the resolution was, part of their argument was that they were queue jumping. And we love that term. And we said, where's this queue? They jumped. Show me the office on Monimong Boulevard in Cambodia where you can go and apply for a migration to Australia. And so they realised that there never was any method process for them to legitimate process they could undertake. So they said, okay, look, we will create a migration program, Cambodia to Australia, and we'd include this group in it. So the criteria for being eligible is you had to have suffered trauma, and everybody had, right? And you had to have a connection to Australia, including having entered Australia as an asylum seeker at any point between these two particular years. So he said, that's fine. So just open the gates and let them out. They said, well, we can't do that because you can't migrate to a country from within a country. And we said, come on, this is just a technical nicety. I mean, we can beam this offshore for the purpose. So, but they made them go back to Cambodia and then return under this scheme, this assisted migration passage. And this was then beginning of 94. So my job was to explain to all this group in Port Hedland, who had been there 4 years by now in detention, that if they return to Cambodia, they can come back as migrants. Of course, they didn't believe a word of it. I mean, they'd grown up under the communist regime and this, that, and the other. You don't sort of trust authority, and of course, it sounded crazy anyway. But I knew it was true. I knew the government would not renege. There's only a handful of people.
So they were allowed to, if they had gone back to Cambodia and then applied for asylum from there, then they would have gotten it.
Well, they will get it. So the idea is you go back to Cambodia, you apply for not asylum, but migration.
Oh, refugee status, sorry.
No, you apply for regular migration. They couldn't call them refugees. And you will be guaranteed a spot. They said, we'll open up, let's say it's 500 spots. We will guarantee you a place on this role. But of course, the people didn't believe it. So they basically said to me, I was the last lawyer up there at this stage. They said to me, look, and I explained to them, I said, look, as crazy as it sounds, I understand it, why they're doing it, and they will not renege. They don't care about 150 people that you come into Australia. They just can't call you refugees for political reasons. So they said, okay, you come back with us. We'll only go if you come back with us and you make them hold this to truth. And I thought, I was going to England 2 years earlier. Now I'm all of a sudden, stuck for 2 years in Port Hedland, and now I'm on my way to Cambodia. I thought, this wasn't what I'd signed up for. But I said, okay, look, I'll do this. I will come back with you. I will make sure we'll keep the government honest. But they had to go back for 1 year. So we tried to negotiate with the Cambodian government, Australian government, just to let them go for a week and come back. They said, no, it's got to be a year. Then they struck a problem, because the problem was in those days, during the 80s, you had to get an exit visa to leave Cambodia, which is typical of sort of communist regimes. You had to get an exit. You had to get permission to leave. You couldn't just leave the country. Just like you had to get a visa to enter, you had to get exit permission. And that's when we said to the Australian government, well, you can't guarantee this. You're not the Cambodian government. So here's a problem with so they realized there was a problem with Seoul. So they arranged with the Cambodian government, bilateral government to government, to drop the exit visa requirement. And that's the reason why the Cambodian government dropped Cambodians no longer have to get permission to leave the country because of this. So the Cambodian government agreed to take away the permissions to get exit permission. So once that happened, then we agreed to do it, and they came back for a year. A lot of the churches paid the way. They were paid by the Australian government to return, and they were given a stipend to sustain themselves while they were in Cambodia, but they were not paid to come back. And so the churches then came through, because they'd been supporting them the whole time, as you can imagine. So they said, okay, we will sponsor, and everybody had to have a sponsor. So they sponsored all 150. Turned out to be more, because some of the young guys came back married and then took wives back with them. So kind of backfired the Australian government. But so I came back for the year. So of course I wasn't paid for that. So that's what brought me to Cambodia. So while I was there, I needed to